All right. Welcome everybody to Find Out Friday. This is the part where we talk about concepts that our developers have been thinking about over the course of the week, and we ask Andrew about them, and he tells us, and he drops a lot of knowledge on us, and it's great. And we record it for posterity. So today, I know that Mike had a question come up over the course of the week about routing, so I'm going to pitch it over to you, Mike, for that.
Yeah, probably more resolving URLs, but yeah, routing kind of in general. So I was trying to deal with some bugs, and in the process of trying to, fix them and also try to make sure that it's sort of uniformly applied to, other blocks or controllers or whatever. Just for consistency's sake, I ran across a lot of ways of sort of resolving URLs. And I'm not really sure, like, which one is best practice or which one is sort of preferred in which situation. So we've got like URL and then to, which is, give it some string and it will resolve it somehow. But then there's also this resolver class, which, you make it the resolve method. And it looks like it kind of does the same thing. So I'm not sure what the benefit is there. And then there's also other classes which have like a URL method or a get collection link method or even an action method. And I've seen all these in the Vue, HTML templates being used. And I assume maybe some of them are just like older and not really preferred anymore. But I was just wondering if we could get kind of an overview of what's the preferred way of doing it nowadays, and like if there's different situations where one is preferred over the other.
Sure, yeah, good questions. And I'm sure any concrete developer who does more than, maybe build a block or the super basics of concrete has probably run into these methods. The moment you need to start actually linking somewhere in a programmatic way, or even just in a template to something that exists, you're going to run into this URL class and the URL2 methods and perhaps some of the other more exotic ones that you were talking about. So in general, if you'll see a lot of this URL class with the static method 2 called after it. So URL : 2. And then the first thing will be a string, and then there may not be anything after that, or there might be some additional parameters. And in general, that is very, very old concrete syntax. It is a way to link to a page by its path. So it will take care of prepending index.php to it. It will also take care of if you've installed concrete in a subdirectory, which is something we used to support, and we still do to various degrees, although it's not, as time marches on, it's not 100% perfect in all situations to install concrete in a subdirectory. People will complain about certain things like, running a cron job results in links that don't have the path because the cron job has no idea what the path to your site is supposed to be, that kind of stuff. So, we really tried to support installing concrete in a subdirectory when we first got started because, in 2004, it was still a premium to have a web space, period. And so people were like doing crazy stuff, like installing multiple sites at different paths on their server. Like it was a wild scene back then. Now people, install it to a domain, and that, domains are cheap, and subdomains and, parked domains are the way that things go. So it's less of a concern, but that was another thing that URL2 did and still does that was a reason it was preferred. You didn't have to, when you're writing your own custom code to link to something, you don't have to do checks to see, is this installed in a subdirectory? If so, I've got to prepend that, because obviously we're not talking about physical files on a server, so we're not doing like relative links on a ahref /. That's not really the way to do it. So what you want to do is if you are linking to like a concrete single page or any page on a concrete site by a path, like /login, /dashboard, /system, /settings, like you want to use URL : 2 to do that. And the reason you want to use that syntax is just because it's always present, because it is an alias, and so you don't even have to import a class to use it. There is a URL class in the global Concrete namespace that is always available in any template. If you're in a controller or any class that has a namespace, you would have to then use URL with the / in front of it. That is not as, if you talk to members of the community, they will strongly discourage you from doing such a thing, because we shouldn't be using aliases in that way. They're really meant mostly for front-end templates and for developers working with templates who don't necessarily, you don't want to have to explain the entire backstory of Concrete and class structure in order to make a freaking URL. Like, you should be able to do certain things easily when you're working with templates. And so that's why this URL class is available in the global namespace. And that's still, it's very old code. It's not going anywhere. There's nothing wrong with it. And it will continue to work likely in perpetuity. I see no reason to change that. The next thing that's kind of interesting about that to method is if you see a second parameter there, what that is for is that actually the first parameter links you to the page. The second parameter runs a method in that page's controller, which then returns a response or renders, a template. And so typically the first parameter is an actual Concrete page by a path, whether it's a single page or a page you created. Then the second method is a method in the controller. Now, when you actually look at the URLs that are generated, they look just like a path. So a lot of times you'll see inexperienced developers, like if they've got a special method, say someone has created a page called, like download file is a good example. There's a download file page installed in Concrete. And so to link to a file, you might link to /download_file. And then
this is actually the thing I was working on when I came across this stuff.
I know you were working on something like that. And then you could just link to it and put a number after it, or a file unique identifier, and it would download, or it would display it in line. It would do whatever it does by default. And you could just link to that directly and have no problem with that. But in the old days of Concrete, we actually used to put a separator between the page path, and then the actual method being run, and then any arguments going to that method would go after that. So in very old Concrete sites, you might see /login or /download file. Then if you're trying to run the force download method on that, you would see / -/ force download, not slash, / and then it's not hyphen, it's a dash. And then the number or the file identifier. Now, many years ago, we kind of made it the code that those URLs worked, and they're actually a bit more performant because you don't have to guess. You don't have to, if you get a page path to something, Concrete actually has to kind of determine what page it should route to by going to the path first and then saying, oh, this actually doesn't match anything. I better find the page that it matches. And it uses these queries to do that in a reasonable way. But in the old days, we didn't have to do that. We could just split on that character in the middle of the URL. But I think somewhere along the line we thought that looked ugly, and it does. The URLs look nicer with that delimiter in there. But that's the reason why those methods in the URL2 are separated that way, and the path is first, and then the method is second, and then any parameters that go to the method are listed after that in a row. But ultimately, in 2023, when you use that, it will just create a URL with one thing right after another. But it's still probably good to, it still shows intention when you do it that way, so that it shows that you are aware that, yep, the first thing I'm linking to is a link to a page. The second thing is a method I want to do. And who knows, in the future, we might scan code and make sure and ensure that you're linking to the right thing, just, to make sure that that the code is future-proof and secure, and written the way the developers haven't made any unintended mistakes with that. So that is sort of how those URL2 methods are structured and why they work that way. They're all about linking to pages and running methods in those page controllers. Yeah, and so there's some other methods of working with URLs that you noticed. One thing that I don't know that you've necessarily touched on here, there's another completely unrelated URL class. This is a concrete URL facade. That's why it's available at the root. That wraps this resolver class that you're talking about. And the resolver is a very complex arrangement of different sort of support classes that can take strings and turn them into URLs in some interesting ways. And we don't really use it to its fullest extent. There's a path URL resolver, and then there's a page URL resolver, and there might be some others in there, but we don't really extend it too much. Although there might be some occasions where you might want to, if you're really deep into the weeds of.
Yeah, I think I saw a calendar resolver and a couple.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, you're probably not wrong. So the idea is you could create your own resolver and push it into the resolver manager, the URL resolver manager. And then in your own custom code, you could, instead of writing URL2 a page link, you can say URL2 and the first parameter is a page. And that actually works today. If you pass a page to the URL2 method, it will know that it's a page object. The page URL resolver gets invoked, and then it links to the page by path. And so you could pass a calendar event, and then it will go in there and it will say, oh, okay, let's find the way to link to this calendar event, which is a completely different thing. Like, it goes into the event, it figures out which page is meant to show the calendar. I think you can do a user as well, and it will show the user's profile page as well. So there's a method to that, but it is pretty complex. And so that's sort of why that exists. It's the resolver is the thing that makes that URL class work. The URL2 method just is a convenience function that invokes the resolver behind the scenes. So what you'll see in a lot of controllers is, since it's kind of a bad practice to just import that URL facade in your controllers, people will pass the resolver manager into the constructor method of controllers, and then they'll just call the to method on that. And the only thing that's different about that, that's kind of weird, is to, when you're calling it from the static class in your templates, takes parameters one right after another. Doesn't take an array. It just takes the first parameter is a link to a page or a page object. The second one is the method, and it just takes an arbitrary number of arguments. But the resolver only takes one. It takes an array, but the array is the thing that can have the multiple things. So when you're using the to method from this resolver, you want to use to and then use an array instead of just passing the thing, which is probably kind of counterintuitive. But I think the reason it works that way is the URL2 method just uses PHP's call user func or it uses the PHP or func get args method to get that into array and pass it into the resolver. So those are sort of two sides of the same coin. One is, but we don't want to get people to understand to have to understand all the ins and outs of the resolver concept and have a PHP and Concrete CMS in order to link to a page on their site. So that the URL2 method in templates is meant to kind of hide the complexity of that whole system, but it's there if you need it. And so then there's some other things that deal with URLs. Tons of objects have their own methods for returning URLs, and those are just for convenience. So like the one you mentioned, page get collection link, like that's there because you shouldn't have, if you already have a page object and you're just trying to link to it, it's pretty lame to have to import another class or to understand, use a whole resolver or do it, understand a whole separate system in order to just get a link. If you're just outputting an ahref link to the stupid page, like you already have the object, you're probably working with it in a template. It's a pretty, you might as well have a separate class for getting the page's name. Like a link is such an important part of working with a page that it has its own method for getting that link in order to output it. We didn't have that for a long time. We had a separate navigation support class, which has get link to collection, which I think you might be working with as well. And like that still is useful, but it's silly that we went so long without having, you know, that method on the page object itself. And then there's some other things as well that like calendar events, they have their own get page or get URL method as well, just for convenience sake. And then finally, I think one thing that I don't know if you even were aware of as well that's kind of useful is there's a completely separate URL class as well, which I started talking about earlier, and then I went into something else. And that is called the league URL class. And league is like a namespace for a bunch of sort of useful secondary dependencies we use. Like we use their class for OAuth 2 server. We use it for their OAuth 2 client for some other custom add-ons. We use it for URL management and, you know, half a dozen other things as well. They're just well-written packages by good PHP developers. And one of the ones that we have used for many, many years is their URL class. And I think it's end of life at this point, but it works well. And I can't imagine the pain of trying to change it. Maybe it wouldn't be as bad as I think. But yeah, there's a league URL class, and it's really just an object-oriented way for working with the URL, which, you know, you think like, why would I need such a thing? It's like, well, you know, working with URLs is annoying, and, you know, there's more to a URL than you would think, and string concatenation is pretty ugly. So the league URL class, a lot of times you'll see that in the code, like a method will not return, like to get a URL, will not return just a string. It will return an instance of a league URL method. And that's so that you can do stuff with that, like in a programmatic way. So you might want to check to see if the link that you're working with is HTTPS. Well, if you just were returned a string, you'd have to do some kind of preg match thing on it, or, you know, some ugly substring check. And instead, league will, if you are returned a league URL instance, I think they have a convenience method to just check, is this a HTTPS URL or something like that? And it just makes it easier to work with URLs, less frustrating to write code, less likely to write code that will break in the future. But the league URL class is nice because if you cast it to a string, like you just output it in a page, you know, by echoing it or something, it will just output as a string. So you, in most cases, you don't even have to be aware that it's a league URL object. The one case where that is not the case and might trip people up actually is if you're using it with like a custom JavaScript component, or you're outputting JSON with it. Like if you're not aware that URL is an object, it will just output as a JavaScript object, and it'll probably be an empty one. You'd be like, what is this? It's supposed to be a URL to a page, and it's just two braces next to each other. That's because it is actually outputting as a JSON object that has no properties. And so always make sure when you're working with these URLs that come from some of these methods, just cast them as a string before you output them into JSON or something like that. That's tripped me up in the past. Not a hard thing to fix, but if you're new to Concrete and you're thinking you're working with something that's super straightforward, and you might lose some time to it and be sad about that. So just a heads up if you.
Yeah, I remember one of the methods I was looking at actually had a comment saying like, yeah, this just returned the string version. If you want the actual object, make sure you call this directly. I think it was URL too, but maybe it wasn't. But anyway, yeah, the full body of the method was just, you know, calling that and then typecasting it to a string.
Yeah, I think that's probably because, you know, like I think that we do use the league URL object behind the scenes a lot, because we do a bunch of stuff as well. Like there are a bunch of Concrete settings that determine whether like you should include index.php in your URLs, or whether you should force HTTPS or force canonical URL or something like that. And so what we do is we'll get a URL from a bunch of resolvers, and then a later resolver will look at it and say, okay, they've turned on the force pretty URLs option, which means I will never include index.php no matter what anything says. And so then that strips that. And so if you're just working with strings, that would suck. And so so we do pass around those URL objects internally a lot. But yeah, I think if you just use URL2 and that could return an object, that would break all kinds of legacy code that's really assuming that it's going to get a string from that object. So I think that's why some of those methods really do cast them as a string and are pretty forceful about that. But behind the scenes, most of that stuff is League URL objects, or our special subclass that subclasses that to add some, crazy functionality that we need.
Yeah, that makes sense. So URL2, just to kind of summarize, is perfectly fine to keep using, especially if you're doing front end type stuff, templates. But if you're doing your own custom controllers or in the core or something like that, you're going to want to use either the League URL directly or the resolver.
Yeah, and I think we could certainly still stand to improve the developer experience with regards to using that stuff in the in controllers. Like, there's nothing wrong. Like, I don't necessarily have a problem with even using the arrays, or the to method works well. I get tripped up with the naming of the classes. Like, it's just, if there were a different class that is whole purpose, much like the URL facade on the front end, if there were a whole class that was just dedicated to wrapping this in a way that developers could remember. Like, I every time I use it in a controller, I have to look up which class I'm supposed to type in. And I've been doing this for 15 years because I don't remember. Is it the resolver? Is it the resolver manager? Is it the resolver manager interface? And I think it's actually the resolver manager interface, which is doing nobody any favors. So yeah, so something to continuous improvement, I suppose.
Okay, so yeah, that makes it a lot, especially the part about certain objects can have their own convenience functions. That makes a lot of the things I've seen make sense, because they were just random things. Like, there was one, I swear it was the basic file viewer, had an action method which would return a URL. I was like, okay, that kind of makes sense.
That is actually another thing to talk about. That's probably more important, or that actually is probably important to mention. And I know you we do have stuff about this in the docs, but it bears repeating. There is an action, much like URL2 is used for linking to a page or an object in a way that is meant to sort of be the entry point. But there are some times where you need to do an operation that is meant to be like a form post or an action on top of something else. So, like, for example, let's say I'm linking to a page that, like, I'm linking to my blog. Like, I would use URL2, and that would be fine. But I have let's say I've got a custom block type, and its job is to, on that blog page, and its job is to, like, collect feedback. Well, it's got a form, and that form needs to submit back to the block controller itself and run a custom method there. Well, I can't do URL2 from that form method because it has to carry a bunch of additional state with it. I mean, not a lot of state. It has to carry the block ID. It has to carry information about what block is submitting to where. And I think it also carries a token as well for cross-site scripting checks. And so it's not just enough to do URL2 within your form method. You actually need to use view action from within those things, precisely so it can carry along additional parameters for this kind of stuff. And I think that's in the block documentation, but it is good to mention, because it is, yes, yet another way to generate a URL, and there is a method to it, its madness. But
yeah, that makes sense. I wasn't paying particularly close attention where I was getting these examples from, but now that you mentioned it was in a form, in the form action
Yeah.
attribute where it was setting that. Yeah.
Sweet.
Yeah, well, that makes sense to me. Did you have anything to add to that, Evan, or you already know
No,
about
no,
all
it was,
this
that was
resolver
interesting.
stuff?
Yeah. I was remembering the action one because I've missed, going back to single page submissions, or just trying to get stuff like that. Get your redirect to the other single page with the data. So
Yeah, no,
it brought me back. It brought me back. So
yeah,
but yeah, no, this has been a good one. It's definitely been illuminating to hear all the different ways we can generate these URLs and kind of the purpose behind all of them. So yeah, no, this is great.
Nice.
Nothing more from me.
Sweet.
So
Sounds good.
Awesome. Well, thanks y'all for coming out. And yeah, we'll do this again one of these coming Fridays.
Sounds
Okay.
good.
Thanks.
All right. Thanks
Thanks,
everybody.
Bye-bye.